Hi there, my name is Kenny Robertson. It's great to be able to do this workshop with you. I live over here in St Andrews in Scotland, and I'm involved in helping Christian unions in Scotland with UCCF. My role particularly is to help them think about evangelism and apologetics. So it's really fun to be able to speak to you on this topic of Netflix and streaming services and how do we engage with them as Christians. How this workshop's going to work, I think, is that I'm going to record a short video here just with some of the content of my thinking on this subject. And then when we come to Zoom together, that will leave us most of the time to be able to discuss stuff in a very interactive way. So if this is just for you to sit and listen to, take some notes on, and it'd be great to hear your questions on things, either things I haven't made clear enough or things that you that are provoked in your mind while you're thinking about it. So it'd be great to hear your questions and see what we can think about them. So the question we've been asked to look at, the question I've been asked to try and address is how, as I said, how do we engage as Christians with streaming services? Now, if we want to think about streaming services, actually, that's part of a broader question, which is how do we engage as Christians with movies and TV in general, which itself is part of an even broader question, which is how do we as Christians engage with the culture that we live in and that we see around us. So while we're talking about this, I want to use some principles and some examples from wider culture and how we engage with that, but also from movies as well as TV shows, because and not least because one of the interesting thing about streaming services is that the lines and the boundaries between movies and TV are so much more blurred than they used to be, which I think is a really interesting cultural phenomenon anyway. But throughout history, Christians have wrestled with this question of how do we engage well and faithfully with the culture that is around us. And we, in that time, we have kind of resorted to one of two extremes. So on the one hand, we might be tempted to what you could call retreat. And then on the other hand, is the temptation to conformity. So we might be tempted either to hide away or to run away from culture and just hide in a bubble and think, oh, everything out there is just really sinful. We don't have anything to do with it. We just want to hide away from it in our own safe space. The other extreme is to become so immersed in the culture that is around us that we end up looking exactly the same, imbibing exactly the same traditions, exactly the same sins, if you like, without seeing any distinctiveness whatsoever. And TV is no different from those temptations. So this would be a long time ago now, but when my dad was growing up, there was a picture house in our hometown, the old word for a cinema, and it was generally thought amongst the Christians at that time that going to the picture house was a sinful thing to do. And also when TV arrived, there were similar amounts of suspicion. And when I was growing up, we had very strict rules about what we could watch and what we could not watch. Also very strict rules about whether or not we could watch TV on a Sunday, which is a discussion for another time. And we see the same thing today in different ways, really, because there are still debates about different shows and whether Christians should or shouldn't watch them. I remember a while back when Harry Potter and the books and the movies were coming out, there was some Christians were saying Christians shouldn't watch or read Harry Potter. There's been a recent debate about Game of Thrones similarly. Whereas at the other side of the spectrum, and I think some of us, most of us in the Western culture are quite tempted to this really, is to think that our faith is completely irrelevant to what we watch on TV. It's got nothing to do with it. Others might say, in Christ we are free. We are free to do anything we want. So I can watch anything I want, and we have no scruples about what we should do. And if anyone should question what we're watching, then they're just being legalists, and they're out to spoil our freedom. The obvious question is, why do we go towards these two extremes? I think the simple reason for that is that as Christians, we are given two very clear commands about what we are to do with the Christian life. On the one hand, we're told to be disciples, and then on the other hand, we're also told to make disciples. So we are called to godliness. We're called to be distinct from the world, to stand out from it, to be set apart. But then on the other hand, we're also called to mission. We're called to engage with the world, to be in the world, but not of it. And that little line of being in the world and not of it, and where the boundaries lie with that, is often where this debate is about. And so really what I want us to do is to try and think of an answer to this very basic question. Is TV, or are streaming services or movies, are they a good thing or are they a bad thing? Are streaming services good or bad? I wonder what you think about that. Maybe there'll be time for discussion about it. I think the answer simply is yes. The streaming services are good and they are bad. It's a bit of both, really. I think the way for us to try and think about answering or understanding that answer to that question is to think of a biblical view of the world. I don't know if you're familiar with this very basic diagram, but this is a summary of the basic plotline of the Bible. The Bible starts with creation, and then you have the fall, and then there's redemption, and then the end goal is the new creation. So let me just take each of those in turn. At the beginning of the Bible, we're told that God created the world and that he thought it was good. Everything was good, and humans in particular were very good. There was no sin in the world. But very shortly after humans arrived, we have the fall, where sin entered the world, and everything in creation was broken as a result. But I think it's important at that point to acknowledge that though everything is broken, that doesn't mean they're completely broken. They're not broken beyond repair. But actually, even though the entire creation is broken, there are still shards of God's original goodness in creation still there, if we look for them. But nonetheless, we have creation and then we have fall, so as a result of both of those things, we live in a world that is both good in some respects, but also not good, and very not good in other respects. And what it's crying out for is redemption, and that's where Jesus wonderfully steps in to restore the original creation to the way it was originally meant to be. And that redemption comes through the person and the work of Jesus Christ. And we experience that redemption as Christians in part now, but one day we will experience it in its fullness. And we are working towards the fullness of that redemption as we live as Christians today. We will see it in full at the new creation. Now, this basic plot line of the Bible affects the entire creation. It not only affects us as individuals in terms of understanding our need for redemption, but it also affects the whole of the created order. And it's really important to remember that the storyline of the Bible is a physical and a spiritual reality, that this physical earth that we live in is experiencing all of those things, that actually it's created as a good thing, it is fundamentally broken at its core, and it's in need of redemption. And Jesus came to save not just humans, but to restore the whole cosmos to the way it's originally meant to be. And that's quite an important point, because that means that then this Bible storyline, this plot line, can be a framework for thinking about everything in culture, not just our own individual salvation. Of course, it does apply to humans. They're an example, an obvious example of this. Humans still can do much good because we're still created in God's image. However, we are fundamentally broken. We're also capable of really bad things as well. We are in desperate need of Christ's redemption. But think of other things in creation. Think of the course that you're studying and how this framework helps us understand it from a Christian point of view. I did my undergraduate in mechanical engineering. It also follows that plot line. So engineering can be a really good thing. It can be a great force for good, and engineers create lots of things that helps develop culture, that helps fix things. Engineering, of course, is also profoundly broken. It can be used for great destruction. Engineers also make bombs as well as bridges. And engineering as a discipline also needs redemption, and particularly it needs Christians to go into that field of work and to bring Christ's redemptive presence into it. And so we can also include Netflix as a part of culture. It also can be understood using this basic plotline. So there are things that are good about Netflix, there are things are bad about Netflix, and there are things that are in need of redemption. So let's take each of those in turn. What is good about Netflix? What's good about TV? Well, Netflix is a great gift for rest. It's great to be able to switch off at the end of the day and watch an episode of your favourite TV show as a way of just switching off and resting. It's also, as an art form, that's one of the reasons I love movies, is as an art form, they're just incredible in terms of the way that they bring different forms of art together, like cinematography and storytelling and acting and all those different things come together as a unique art form that an art has been given for our good as humans. So there's lots of things you can think of like that that are good about Netflix, and I wonder if you can think of any more. Secondly, what's bad about Netflix? How has the fall affected it? Well, in different ways. There's the obvious bad things. So there's sex, violence, drug use, and bad language they're considered to be the four kind of most obvious bad things, and those are important, serious things. But actually, there's also other ways in which, more subtle ways in which movies can be really unhelpful and bad. Here's a thought-provoking statement for you. See what you think of this. There is no such thing as truly mindless TV. What do you think of that? There is no such thing as truly mindless TV. Now, you might be thinking, well, Made in Chelsea or whatever it's called, there are some serious candidates for thoughtless TV like Towie or, well, that's just my opinion. You may disagree with that. But what I mean is, all TV shows have a way of viewing the world, a worldview that they are both presenting and promoting. And I think we're very thoughtful as Christians, I think, when it comes to things like sexual gratuity or violence or language, that kind of thing. Our antennae are up about those kind of things. But we're possibly more susceptible to the subtle influence that some of these TV shows can have on our way of viewing the world. So take Disney as an example. Now, I love the fact that people love Disney. My kids are really into Disney at the moment. But Disney is clearly presenting a narrative that is actually quite persuasive. It's saying basically the key to happiness, the key to fulfillment is just to be your true self. Now, we kind of know that because it's kind of obvious, but at the same time, we totally imbibe it. And that has become an intrinsic part of our cultural value, largely because of Disney. Or you think about another example might be reality TV. And now you might be a big fan of reality TV. I'm not personally a fan. I'm not going to tell you that you shouldn't be watching it, but it's clear to me that reality TV presents and promotes a very clear set of values, suggesting that appearance really matters and that the approval of others really matters. And not just that those things are important and good, but that actually that's where you find your sense of worth. That is clearly something that is presented by reality TV. And so we've got to be really careful about not only the things that are obvious in terms of the fall and sin's effect on Netflix, but also the more subtle examples as well. Third thing is to think about redemption. Now, obviously, as Christians, we know that redemption can only be found in the person of Jesus Christ. But actually, most of the TV shows we watch are also looking for redemption in some way and may well be offering a form of redemption and actually offering a form of Jesus, the true Redeemer, without necessarily realizing it. So you take, for example, the Marvel Universe, One of the reasons I think Marvel is so popular is because it shows that people are crying out for a savior figure. Because that's one of the key elements to all of these superhero movies, is that they're all savior figures that we need to rescue us from the mess that the world is in. And I think it's also, just as an aside, it's really interesting to note that actually superheroes used to be flawless beings, but now they're increasingly more flawed, even though they can still redeem the world, because that makes it easier for us to identify with them. That's a really interesting theological point. A discussion for another time, maybe. So you can see that Netflix can also be very helpfully understood using this biblical framework of understanding the world. That the whole of the world is about creation, fall, redemption, and new creation. Now, last thing then is if all of that is true, if this framework gives us an understanding of Netflix, then how then do we watch well? How do we engage well as Christians with streaming services? Well, I think the way to do that is to apply this biblical worldview to the two commands that we have as Christians, both to be disciples and to make disciples. So apply that worldview to the questions of godliness and of mission. So how do we watch Netflix in a way that is godly? I think the very simple principle here is know your own limits. I'm a little uncomfortable when people put rules around what TV shows we should and shouldn't watch. Obviously, there are some clear boundaries, but actually sometimes the boundaries aren't clear at all. And I think the simple thing is know your own limits. What are the things that you are susceptible to? And I think you just have to be brutally honest with yourself. So if, for example, you might think, well, watching scenes of drug use doesn't really affect me because that's not something I'm tempted towards, but actually scenes of a gratuitous sexual or violent nature might be more tempting to me. I found that actually I didn't think that violent scenes really affected me, but then I have noticed that when I'm watching a violent TV program, it does actually affect my anger. And so I try not to watch those kind of things now. But as well as knowing yourself, I think it's also very helpful to know the limits of those who are around you. So if you're watching a TV show and it doesn't necessarily affect you, I would say just be careful about how you might talk about that with others, because it might be a TV show that's extremely unhelpful for other people to watch. But the key thing there is to be brutally honest with yourself and don't lie to yourself about where your limits are. So know your limits and the limits of those around you. And then secondly, I think when it comes to how do we engage with Netflix well in terms of mission, I think the key principle is listen well. The late pastor and author John Stott, in his classic book, The Contemporary Christian, encourages the principle of what he calls double listening, which is that as Christians, we have a responsibility to, on the one hand, to listen very carefully to Scripture, but then also on the second hand, to listen to culture very carefully. And he does not give equal weight to both of those things. But as actually is Karl Barth, the theologian Karl Barth, who said, we must have the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other, but our reading of the Bible should inform our reading of the newspaper. So the Scriptures are our authority, but we need to listen very well to culture, not as an authority on us, but in order to understand how then do we bring the Scriptures to bear on that culture. So we need to listen well to the culture around us. And I think the way to listen well is simply to ask lots of questions and listen carefully to the answers. So when it comes to Netflix, as an example, I think simply we can ask questions that are as simple as, what's good about this show? What's bad about this show? What's not so good about this show? And where's the redemption in this show? So in what sense does this show give insight to the world's issue of being created, being fallen, and seeking redemption? Let me give a couple of examples from two things that I've been watching recently. Number one, Parks and Recreation. a little bit dated. During lockdown, my wife and I have committed to watching it from beginning to end, just for the sheer joy of Leslie Knope. And I absolutely love Parks and Recreation. Now, let's ask the questions. What's good about it? I think one of the things that's really good about Parks and Rec is the relentless optimism of Leslie Knope. She always seeks to find the good in other people. She wants to encourage that good. She works really hard to serve others, and she really believes in the principle of government helping people. And that's just a really good thing that Christians can fundamentally support. And I think what's also really interesting about that, personally, is that her relentless optimism is a constant challenge to cynicism. And I think that's a really good thing. Maybe we can discuss that more. Okay, what's not so good about Parks and Rec? Where is it susceptible to the effects of the fall? Well, I think one of the values it really espouses is the classic Disney thing of you've just got to be true to yourself. And we see that in people like Anne Perkins, who is encouraged to just find who she really is, to go and find herself. And that's where she'll find happiness. The irony in the show is that we have other characters like the TV personality who is perfectly trying to do that, but is also a complete train wreck. Another I think thing that's not so good about Parks and Rec is that it denies the reality of hardship to some extent. Where's the redemption found as well? I think this is something that's not so good about Parks and Rec, is that Leslie finds her redemption in hard work. As long as she works hard enough, then a solution can be found to every problem. And that's a form of religion, isn't it? That actually it's about us working harder in order to redeem ourselves. Let me give another example. This is a movie I watched last week. It's the movie Knives Out, which is a really great whodunit, if you like mystery, Agatha Christie kind of things. What's good about it? This is just a quick thing off the top of my head. What's good about Knives Out? It really values the importance of truth. It also really acknowledges the corruptive power of money. What's not so good about Knives Out? Well, I'd have to think about this a little bit more because I actually thought it was really good. But I wonder whether one of the things that's not so good is that it tends to have a polarized view of humans, that you're either a good person or a bad person. You're either one or the other, whereas maybe the Bible would say we are definitely a mixture of both, all of us. Where's the redemption found in Knives Out? I think to some extent, without wanting to give the plot away in any sense, the redemption is found in kindness. The kindness that the house nurse offers to people is where the redemptive qualities are found in the movie. Now, that's really good in one sense, isn't it? Because that is part of the answer. Jesus is the epitome of kindness. But it's not, of course, the whole story. So it's pointing in the right direction, but it needs more to it. Okay, I've spoken for way long enough. I will give a summary of this when we do our Zoom chat. But I want to put out some questions for you, and they will be following me on the screen. But thanks for listening. Hope this is thought-provoking and helpful, and I really look forward to hearing your thoughts and your comments on this. So, see you soon.